from the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University and the Professor of Cultural Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast this week, which is titled, What is the Point of a PhD or Research Master's Examination? Now, this is a great question. In fact, it comes via request from a lovely lass, Jess, who's one of our PhD students, yesterday. And she said to me, what exactly is a PhD examination and what is its point? And I think that was a tremendous question. A lot of guys and gals out there have heard me talk about one of the great problems in teaching and learning, I think, is assumptions. That in our head we have this notion of everybody knows what first year teaching is about, everybody knows what a PhD is, everybody knows what a PhD examination is about. And of course, why would a PhD student know what an examination is? Because they haven't done one yet. So why this topic is quite timely is I have great news to share with people all around the world. The Office of Graduate Research is now managing the examinations at Flinders University, and that is incredibly exciting for us. We have incredibly modern regulations, protocols and procedures. As far as I'm concerned, I believe we now have the best examination of doctoral education in the world. And it's rare for me to say that, but it is a fantastic set of procedures that is transparent and clear for examiners and also transparent and clear for supervisors and students. But I do want to address Jess's question because obviously we're talking about policies and procedures and stuff. But what does all of this mean for a student doing a PhD? What's the role of the examination in their daily research? So to help me work through this conversation and set of ideas for Jess, I want to welcome Steve. Good morning, Steve Redhead.
Good morning.
Professor of Cultural Studies at Flinders University. And Steve, obviously very experienced supervisor, but also examiner and international examiner, which is why I want to particularly talk with you about this today. You're doing a series of examinations almost on a weekly basis these days around the world, and you've got some fabulous Kiwi examinations coming up as well with their very specific doctoral practice. But therefore, Steve, the first question is really answering Jess's question, what is the point of a PhD examination?
Yes, it is a good question because actually it's left up in the air a lot of the time, especially in a system like in Australia where you don't have an oral exam. I think the oral exam changes the nature of what the examination is for,
Agreed.
What kind of criteria it's looking at. But I think the idea of the examination is all over the place, really. As you say, I've just been nominated for another external examinership at the University of Otago, New Zealand. And not long ago, New Zealand didn't have oral exams, but actually its system, I think for all its universities now, includes oral exam. But the thing about Australia is that all the different universities have a different idea of what the examination is about, and they all don't, most of them, don't have oral exams. So I think because it's left all over the place, it's left it up in the air, it's very often determined by the examiners, and I think that's a real problem. So I've been sub-dean graduate studies and all sorts of other administrative positions in Australia, looking at actually how you examine and what you're examining for and what the backup systems are. And it seemed to me that very often the actual examiners were determining what the examination criteria were. That's not to say that there weren't written rules, there were, but it becomes very, very individual and very individualistic. I think that's a real worry.
You're right, and of course as part of our regs, part of our regulations, we have a series of criteria that is given to the examiners, and you and I might do a podcast or a vlog going through what those criteria mean. I think that would unpack them for students and supervisors. That's very useful. But I absolutely think you're right, and you are right, and the research shows, Steve, the more experienced the examiner, the less likely they are to read the university's regulations.
Right.
So, and again, because in their head, they know what the standards are. So I think you've unpicked and unpacked something very important.
It's very subjective, I think.
Deeply subjective. And we're going to loop back there in a second, Steve, because the subjectivity of doctoral examination can be profoundly frightening, I think, for students and for their supervisors, and also for those of us who are trying to care for and also ensure quality in this doctoral space. So why are external examiners international leaders in their field? Why do we particularly want external examiners, which makes it different to many areas of undergraduate life, and why must they be international and top end in their field?
Certainly I think that's the idea. Yes, that's the gold standard, if you like. But very often that isn't actually the case. That a lot of the time, if you're an experienced external examiner like I am, you're actually examining with people, maybe one or two other people in the case of Australia, who aren't actually very experienced, who are doing things for the first time, and again, I think there is this subjectivity actually across external examiners, experienced and non-experienced, which is a great problem. It's interesting to say that there are studies which actually show that people don't read the regulations. It's a sense, people have this sense in doctoral education that they know what it's all about, and very often that's based on their own experience in their own PhDs and so on. It's a problem.
You're absolutely right, and of course everybody out there's heard me thousands of times in writing, in speeches and all the rest of it, getting really cross that we're confusing experience and expertise in doctoral education.
That's exactly what's happened.
And the problem, particularly in Australia, and why I'm so focused on the oral exam, is because it is a space for feedback for examiners. So because you've got 2 or 3 there, often with a chair as well, it's a bit of an echo chamber whereby if you've got a rogue examiner, he's pulled back into line. He's socialised, if you like, into correct procedures. And also, more inexperienced examiners are socialised into, mate, this is actually what you're meant to be doing, right? But with the Australian system, which is you are assessing a printed document or a digitised document on a screen, and you are writing an independent report. If you're way out of the park, right, if you are completely dissonant from what the other examiner has done, you'll never really know that. You'll never, and I would love, and of course I'm a long way away from being able to do something like this, but I would love to be, as a Dean of Graduate Research, writing back to the examiner and thanking them for their contribution to the university, but also stating, this mark was given by you, these were the other marks that were given. And of course, we're a long way away from that because it's independent, confidentiality, all the rest of it. But the one advantage of actually disclosing the marks in the cluster, if you will, around that student is the examiner gets feedback. Now, in the Australian system, an examiner never gets feedback.
No, that's right. And therefore doesn't learn from the mistakes that are made. And also I think that actually the biggest problem of all is not really addressed, which is that examiners look at the text and then want something else than that text to be examining. I think that's the biggest problem of all, and that comes from this subjective sense of I know what a PhD is.
Yes.
I've seen that so many times in all my different roles around the world, and the idea is surely that the PhD as it is examined, not what the examiner thinks should have been done. And that's really the most common problem, and it's never addressed. There's no feedback on it.
And we've often talked about, in fact, we've done podcasts on the importance of training examiners. I've yet to get up a training for examiners protocol. I really believe in it, and I believe it should happen. And the number one lesson that I would teach in examination is, team, you are examining the student's project, not what you would have done if you'd taken on that project. It's not your project, you're the examiner. You are assessing what's there, not what should be there. So, for example, I have recently, I haven't liked, probably, to be frank with you, the last 20 theses that I've examined. I've been doing a lot of, particularly feminist and popular culture and weird, stuff that I just really haven't liked. Right? Just to be frank with you, I haven't liked the theorists they've chosen. I just thought, oh dear me. But by the same token, the overwhelming majority of them, in fact all of them, went through as a 1, a straight through, or an A in the Flinders system, or a 2, a minor correction, or a B in the Flinders system. Because it's not what I think. It's not what I feel about the topic. It is me assessing the calibre of that research. So I think that's where the mistakes are being made. So we're probably frightening Jess to hell here at this point. So let's pull it back a little bit for her if I can, Steve, and let's talk about the first meeting, really. We've got a large number of students starting at Flinders shortly. So you start and I start our first meetings in supervision, first year, first meeting, talking about examiners. So I suppose in some ways the question that Jess raised wouldn't happen, because from the first meeting we talk about the examination of that thesis. First meeting. Why do we do that?
Because in the end, certainly in the Australian system, which doesn't have an oral exam, you're actually trying to encourage the student to realise that the only audience that matters is actually, at the end, 2 or 3 people.
Yep. And
they're the external examiners. And therefore, as you're constructing your thesis, you're writing for a particular audience, and that's not the supervisors. That's always the great difficulty. But I think that instruction to students at the beginning to realise that that's what they're doing is really important. And obviously, in a sense, the earlier that you can choose external examiners, the better, because then the student really is writing for a particular audience of 2 or 3 people. I think that's absolutely crucial, because most people, as PhD students, are writing to try and please their supervisors. Actually, that's not the issue.
See, and I think that's so wise, because, as the Dean of Graduate Research, I see all the good and the bad in the supervisory relationships. And, the student and supervisor, it's almost locked into a deathly embrace at times. For me, it's much too intense, it's much too close, and, bad things happen in that space. Whereas actually, I think you and I supervise with great kindness and respect and decency our students. We get on incredibly well with them. We've very rarely had any issues with any of our students, because we're very clear at the start, team, we adore you, we'll look after you, we are your supervisors, we have supervision, we'll give you everything we can, but you're not writing for us. You're writing for examiners. So in some ways, that takes the heat out of the relationship a little bit, because they're not pleasing us.
That's right.
The examiners.
But I think what happens, and I've noticed particularly in Australia, but also other countries that I've worked in around the world in terms of PhDs, students are increasingly in an economic relationship, at least, with their supervisors, because people, particularly in the sciences, have them as their lab assistants almost.
Basically.
That system, which produces all sorts of rorts, in my view, and is a real problem and is very much unregulated or underregulated, is actually producing that deep relationship where the student thinks that they have to write for the supervisor, and indeed in that relationship it actually is writing the supervisor's work in many ways. So I think that's a real problem. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't have an economic relationship, and very often students, are part of a research assistant system.
And that's
There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. And economically, in the neoliberal university, that's happening more and more. Yeah. But it produces all sorts of, let's say, rorts and really side effects, which are a problem. You have to get back to the relationship where you're certainly, you're trying to treat the student as a human being, and to, but also to produce the highest possible quality you can in terms of an external examiner's view of it. It's not the supervisor's view of it.
I think that's very powerful, and I think you've just raised a very important economic point there, and I think that exists from the hard sciences right the way through to the humanities.
Absolutely.
Actually.
Absolutely.
That, the lab culture has always existed, and there's always been a large project that each individual in a lab works on. So there's always been, I don't think that's changed. The economic variable has, but in the humanities as well, the students are reliant on the patronage of the supervisor for teaching, which pays their bills. Yeah,
or to be part of a research project, which is funded and so on.
I think that's a very good point, but we do need to separate all of that out. So pleasing the supervisor, it might be the economic imperative, but the intellectual imperative is pleasing an examiner.
Yeah.
and that's completely different. So, Jess, I hope that's helping a little bit for you. So, really, right at the start, I would, for any supervisors that are listening to this podcast, I would encourage you, right at the start of the candidature, talk about the examination. The idea that we've got a lass who I think is a year in to a PhD, sort of saying, well, you know, what's this examination thing? Is really a powerful lesson, I think, and that's why we, basically the day after Jess sent me this email, we're doing this podcast to address this issue. So first meeting, really I'd start talking about examination. Last question, if I can, Steve, and it's a tough one. In comparison to the other modes of assessment, say for undergraduates or in coursework masters, the PhD examination is, I would argue, completely different now from every other mode. It used to be a little bit synergetic, but now it is completely different. Two people are making a determination, and in a non-oral examination system, they're making it completely independently, right?
Without reference to each other.
So why is it like that? What are the strengths? What are the problems of it? Why have we almost got this sort of still 19th century model of examination in the 21st century? Why is it still different from the rest of what's happening in a university in assessment?
I think it is almost medieval.
Phew.
And the university itself is a medieval institution.
Correct.
But actually, I think that it should be different. I don't think we should be trying to bring down the PhD to these other areas like masters or undergraduate. I really do think that it still has to be an elite qualification, and I think the examination has to be part of that. It has to look at this as an original contribution to knowledge. None of the other things you produce within a university and are examined have to be an original contribution to knowledge.
And a lot of publications
that goes with that. Absolutely.
Post-PhD, a lot of publications
are absolutely. So you have to keep that. I think the danger, in many ways, as we, in this neoliberal university system, as things become more marketised and commoditised, actually the danger is that it is brought down from this elite qualification, this elite examination. I would say that we have to preserve that.
I agree, and I remember when you and I decided that we would come to Adelaide, one of the reasons I took this job, and we had a fair number of options that were available in all sorts of different areas around the world. And why we decided that I would take this job at this point as a portfolio dean, which is a very rare and special job, as the Dean of Graduate Research, and I remember the conversation we had in Bathurst actually, was let's stand for something. And I remember we used the language, if the doctorate is dumbed down, then we've lost our universities. And so this was an opportunity to make a point at a really great university like Flinders, which has high standards, great students, great supervisors, to say, you know what, we stand for something and we won't dumb down the doctorate. But I suppose the only follow-up question I'd ask there, Steve, is it is frightening for students and supervisors because it is reliant on the expertise, the integrity of 2 or 3 people to have high-level scholarship and to have the expertise to do the right thing, to understand what a PhD level is. And that's very demanding, I think. Yes,
and it makes the point, really, that the examiners really have to do that job. They have to do the job as independent examiners, but also of maintaining the standards of examining the text as it is, not as somebody else wishes it to be.
Really powerful. Jess, look, I hope that's helped unpack the doctoral examination a bit. It is frightening, and look, I can't tell you the fear. I don't know if Steve feels this, but when I'm finding examiners for my students, I am really frightened a lot of the time, and I digitally stalk them, and I really am conscious of, is this person brilliant? Is this person at the head of their field? But also, have they got integrity? Have they got intellectual generosity to enable the next generation? Or are they jealous and envious and bitter and twisted and might actually turn on the student because they have expertise and may replace them? There's all sorts
that certainly happens.
Absolutely. We've seen it a few times. So, and you never know. I mean, the only other quick example I'll give, we'll add a quick example to the end of this podcast, is, Steve, you were doing an oral examination in the UK. And you actually brought in as a replacement examiner. They had to null and void an examination because an examiner was supposedly having a fight with the supervisor that the supervisor didn't know about, and the hatred the examiner felt for the supervisor manifested in the oral exam, and this person savaged the student, and the student appealed and so forth, and you were brought in as sort of the man of integrity to try and sort this out. But that was a shocking experience. And
it was, but there's lots of examples, not necessarily as bad as that, but there's lots of examples of that, which is why the standards of examination, which we've been talking about today, are so important.
Absolutely. So what we're trying to do at Flinders is the reason regulations and procedures and protocols matter so much is in an area that is probably under-regulated, to be frank with you, and also hasn't got the international mobility and surveillance and scrutiny that I would like, to be frank with you. We're able to at least provide a framework around students, around supervisors and examination that is transparent, accountable and fair. So if examiners do decide to read the criteria by which we assess a PhD, then they will see very clear criteria by which it can be evaluated, and they have a protocol to follow. And so, Steve, I think we might do another podcast where we actually go through the criteria of what an examiner is after when they're looking at a PhD and unpack that for supervisors and for students as well. So, Steve, thank you for your time, and Jess, fascinating question, and good on you for your courage in asking it, my love. For more information about the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University, please refer to www.flinders.edu.au/graduate-research.